Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. This morning, in your virtual podcast stocking, you have a very special present, a festive episode. That's right, this time round, we are talking all things Christmas before Dickens. That is, Christmas in the day of Austen and Wollstonecraft, Wellington and Nelson, Pitt the Younger and Castlereagh, and Sharpe and Harper. We have already recorded an episode on Christmas food in that age, which I believe actually, thanks to the magic of the podcast verse, you'll be receiving after this episode, so you have that to look forward to. But before then, we're going more general. As such, today we are interviewing the podcast's resident generalist, Dr. Memory, Mr. Waterloo Tat, Professor Spectacle, the guy who knows about horse theatre performances, reenacting battles. It's our very own Beau, Luke Reynolds.
I like that. The podcast's very own generalist. I will take that. That's a title I will embrace. And damn Zach from yelling at me about making more. That one's all on you. No, I'm here for this. Thank you for that, Josh, and thank you for having me.
You
Um,
ignored all the other titles I gave you.
I can't argue. I mean, like I can't argue with any of them, but I particularly enjoy the generalist one. But yeah, no, I do enjoy all of those. And I should say that I am here as a generalist, right? I am not an expert in this. I am, I was frantically doing research this week. I was doing what I think inevitably we all acknowledge that inevitably you will end up in a graduate program, Josh.
Hopefully.
And hopefully, no, I think that if you want it, it's there. I think you've got the nous for it. But what you will learn, and what I explain to my students every once in a while, which is that they don't actually teach us to know everything. We just learn how to pretend that we know everything. What they teach us is how to find information. And
Hmm.
so I have been doing research, and I'm going to start actually with a recommendation. If you are interested in all of this stuff at a little more detail than I'm going to go, I highly recommend Neil Armstrong's Christmas in 19th century England.
Neil Armstrong.
Neil Armstrong, not that one.
Okay.
Sadly. No, this one is actually it was a very talented senior lecturer in history at Teesside University, and he very sadly passed away in 2015. But he wrote this sort of wonderful little exploration. I think it's actually in Manchester University Press's Studies in Popular Culture series. And they first published it in 2010, and then they brought it back in 2020 because it had gone out of print, but everyone kept wanting to buy it because Christmas history is of interest at least a couple months out of the year.
Hmm. Well, I guess this is testament to your generalist status that you are here as our Christmas guy, and you're very modest, saying you don't, you're not an expert. But as we're about to find out, I'm sure you are because you know a lot about a lot of things, Luke. Um, I have the first question, and at the risk of asking you to do the whole episode in the first 5 minutes, big question: what did Christmas look like in the early 19th century?
Okay, I'm gonna take that as a general look like, not an aesthetic look like.
Yeah, that's the right way to
Aesthetically,
take it.
yeah, no, fair enough. Although I will say, of course, that sort of, um, there is this sort of interest in, and I think one of the reasons that we have this sort of association with White Christmas and the like is that a lot of the Christmas ideals that we're thinking about they're not created yet, but they're in the process of being created. And this is also the period of the Little Ice Age, as our listeners will know, right? It's messing with crops and all of that. And it's one of the reasons we get these sort of famines. But we also get cold winters, right? The last frost fair on the Thames is 1816. The Thames gets cold enough to actually freeze. And part of that is also the old London Bridge that slowed the water through enough that it could freeze. But yeah, let's go back to the general. So let's yeah, in broad terms, we're looking at a holiday that compared to today is more food centric. It's less children and family centered, and depending on where you are and who you are, is longer. It still harks back to the old sort of medieval, lasting from Christmas Eve slash Christmas Day all the way to Epiphany slash Twelfth Night, right? Those are the 12 days of Christmas. Now we're all familiar with that from the song, but generally that's all we associate it with these days. Whereas at this point, it was genuinely 12 days. So we have a whole episode coming on food, so I'm going to talk only briefly about this, but it is worth sort of noting. Food has always anchored Christmas in the British Isles, along with alcohol. And in the late medieval period, Christmas was really marked by, or Christmas time or Christmas tide was marked by feasting. And this trend continued. Now, by the late 18th century, Turkey was already well established. That may seem odd, and in fact, we talk about this in our in the Christmas episode a little bit of why. And I finally found an answer to this, and it's because upon its introduction in the mid 16th century, Turkey slowly began to replace the other traditional feast bird in Britain, which was the swan. So as turkeys became more common, it was easier to grow them. They're much easier to be kept in captivity and farmed than swans are. They also, and this admittedly is a very low bar, they're less dickish than swans are. And so they slowly start to become the standard. So they replace the swan.
At the risk of asking a question you might not know the answer to, I mean, it's it's the case in England today, as you might know, that swans are the property of the royal family, right? I
Mm.
mean, was that still the case in the 18th century and earlier, or was this something that came about after that change?
I believe it was the case in the 18th century and earlier. I'm not sure when exactly it kicked in. Um, but it wouldn't surprise me, and that's again another reason why I think turkeys started to become. It was a way for non-royals but well-to-do people to sort of ape that royal tradition, right? They could have a feast bird at Christmas. Why it was turkey and not goose, I think, is a matter again of that farming ability, right? You know, you can grow turkeys, you can keep them more efficiently than you can geese. To give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of numbers, the Times estimated that 30,000 turkeys were consumed during the 1788 Christmas season. They were grown in sort of what we now refer to as the home counties, or they were kept in the home counties, and they were sent to London by stagecoach, which is a spectacular image, although presumably a very noisy and smelly stagecoach by the end. And in addition, for most of the 19th century, because we don't have, right, we don't have the freezer sections, we don't have the grocery stores, we don't have everything that we're used to. Um, Country folk would send parcels of turkeys and other produce to city friends. That would be the sort of their Christmas gift. They'd send the food for Christmas to their friends in the city and sort of build on from there. Now, in the period we're talking about, right, which I loosely defined as sort of the first half of the 19th century for this interview, Turkey was for the elite, right? It was still not standard. And beef was sort of the go-to for others. It was the national dish. It was extremely popular. It was invested in tradition, with tradition. And of course, you can get a lot more food off of a full-on beef carcass than you can off of a dead turkey. And so we end up with this situation where a lot of the market towns would have livestock markets right before Christmas. The butchers would, you know, get what they wanted, and then they display the full-on butchered carcasses in their windows to sort of draw people in and select the choicest cuts of beef and the like. And in fact, food is where we first start to see Christmas markets and commercial decorations as we would understand them, right? So what we now recognize is sort of, oh, you know, there's markets on the Thames or in Trafalgar Square to buy tat and things like that and, you know, get your local handcrafted presents. Those started with things like Covent Garden and the usual food markets, some greenery, and that sort of, you know, Christmas markets and then shops vying with each other to provide provisions for people. And decorations brought people in, and you begin to see, as we'll talk about in a little bit, more and more advertising. So that's the food side of this. The other one of the really big changes that we don't see anymore, but that you would have seen in this period, is fundamentally what I've got marked in my notes simply as invite list, right? The invitations. Not in terms of the physical paper or all of that, but just who was invited. Christmas being an almost exclusively family holiday and one that privileges children above all is a mid to late 19th century development. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Christmas was more of a group and community thing. It was a festival for friends, for family, yes, for family, but not just for family, for found family, to use the modern term, dependents, and all those who would benefit from good cheer. So, aristocrats and the gentry would host events for their friends, but also for all of those that worked their land and depended on them and sort of their social circles. Basically, everyone who would have gone to the local assembly rooms for a ball, say. All of those would be invited around. Washington Irving talks about this in his story, Old Christmas at Bracebridge Hall, which you can find in his sketchbook if you're curious about it. Bosses and business owners would also celebrate with their employees. Now, we have a version of this today, right? The office Christmas party that is sort of the classic. Um, but in this case, think more sort of Fezziwig's Ball from A Christmas Carol, right? Everything shuts down and it becomes a good old-fashioned shindig. Now, what you've twigged to, I can see it in your eyes, and what some of our listeners hopefully will, is that both of these, right, both the sort of aristocrats and gentry on one side and the bosses and the business owners on the other, their traditions are designed to reinforce the traditional paternalistic hierarchy, right? It's about where the food comes from. It's very sort of classically, this is, the good old people have the land, they have the money, and we are at their benefit for, to enjoy their largesse, while simultaneously obviously trying to conceal that behind a festival of goodwill and good cheer and stuff like that. So we have that's sort of the day to day. We of course have house parties and larger groups gathering to celebrate together, and this leads into the feasting and games. And this was sort of the classic image, right? It was one steeped in tradition and paternalism. It was one that had a lot of fun attached to it and a lot of food attached to it. But we have some presents, we have some gifting, but it's not what we're familiar with today. This starts to, I mean, look, it's history, right? It's always shifting. There is no standard at any one point. But what we see sort of in the 1780s and 90s is a move towards the aristocracy going into London to party instead. And in fact, the Times uses Christmas to attack aristocratic vice and dissipation, basically saying, what are you doing gambling in London rather than keeping the traditions of hospitality alive in your country seats? Now, for all that you have that sort of, why aren't you doing this the way you should be doing this? Why aren't you in the country, holding up good English cheer? You still have a Christmas that is in many cases more boisterous than we would be familiar with. Right now, we all have that story of the uncle who gets a little bit too into the port or the sherry or something like that. And Christmas is a time for good food and good liquor and all of that as well. But this is, in the early 19th, in the 18th and early 19th century, you have a Christmas that is associated much more with sort of the boisterous side, alcohol, feasting, but also topsy-turvy and misrule, right? The twisting of the usual social order in a way that, by highlighting its differences, automatically reinforces the traditional order for the rest of the year, right? One night where the rules are reversed, in fact, reinforces the rules rather than shattering them. So you have servants' balls, where for one night the gentry and the aristocrats act as the servants, and the servants get to dress up and dance and party. You have the traditions of, say, mistletoe, right? We think of mistletoe simply as sort of that classic, but if you think about it from a sort of pseudo-socially conservative viewpoint, it's an excuse to go to behave in a courting manner with someone that you're not maybe necessarily courting, right? So there is some chaos thrown in there with that. The idea of Father Christmas, in the modern sense that we recognize him, is a late 19th and even early 20th century concept. But he first appears in England in the 17th century as the personification of feasting and games with no connection to presents or children. And again, I'm going to call on, yes, I know this is called Christmas Before Dickens, but I'm calling on Dickens again, right, with the spirit of Christmas present, who is sort of this pseudo Father Christmas figure in a green robe, but the robe is open basically to the navel. There's a lot of chest hair there. There's a crown of laurels. There's food everywhere. There's no presents, and there's very much sort of boisterous activity going on. That's what we're looking at. And it's really only in the 1850s that he starts to change from what effectively is a lord of misrule, hard eating, hard drinking, usually pretty well padded but covered in fur, to the child-friendly version we recognize. So the scotch and the small beer goes away, and the Coca-Cola comes in, right? And the giant stuffed capon goes away, and the box of chocolates comes in instead. Because it's not so family oriented, there's a whole different level of what's going on. Obviously, there's dinners, there's balls, there's things like that. There's also games. Now some of these we're familiar with, things like Blind Man's Buff. But there's also Snapdragon, which involves trying to grab forfeits and raisins out of a bowl of burning brandy. And you then eat them, and because they've been soaked in the brandy, you get drunker and drunker, and it gets harder and harder to pull them out. And I have no doubt that more than one good house was burnt down by a game of Snapdragon gone terribly wrong. You also have, again, those things that upset and at the same time confirm the social order. There was a tradition on Twelfth Night to basically name a king and queen of Twelfth Night, which was usually the host and hostess. And then everyone would draw titles out of a bowl or a hat to create this sort of court of Twelfth Night that would, basically role play and have fun for the rest of the night before everything went back to normal. Now that's Twelfth Night, and that really brings me on to the other side of this, which is duration. Right. Now we're used to the Christmas season in the UK basically starting immediately after Halloween. And I was in the UK for a conference in September, and Liberty had its Christmas shop up and all of this. Like it's earlier and earlier every year, and I know everyone says that. And then it goes to Christmas Day, and then there's that, in modern office parlance, that sort of week between Christmas and New Year's where no one knows what the hell's going on and everyone's just full of alcohol and cheese in agricultural areas at this point, and agricultural areas are shrinking, but they are still there. Midwinter is cold and lean, but often less extreme in terms of field work, right? Yes, you have to feed the animals, yes, you have to do that, but you don't have to gather in crops or plant or anything like that. And sometimes that's even extended further by poor weather. And this is one of the reasons that the medieval standard was 12 days of feasting, because it was indoors, it's what you could do. And it was also, as we talk about in the other podcast that's coming, really the one time in winter that people ate to satiation. Now, this is also changing, not the satiation, although to a certain extent, but the time is changing as we're looking at this, right? Christmas is about time off, but this is also the period of the rising industrial revolution, urbanism, new ideas, and that new industrial age is demanding more and more work. And so the 12 days of Christmas, which was the medieval standard, starts to shrink due to real wages, economic pressures. There's pressures from dissenting Protestants who maintain that Christmas is a Catholic tradition and shouldn't be celebrated at all. Um, and there's, sort of drive that way. So the Industrial Revolution, work standards, modernity in general, strips people of time off. And that's actually led by the government. If you look at sort of government offices like the Court of Excise and things like that in the 1770s, they're closed for 2 weeks straight. From Christmas to New Year, and basically in between. And they go from that to just being closed Christmas Day, sometimes New Year's, and sometimes Epiphany, right? So it becomes one day. It goes from 12 days to 10 days to 5 days, to, maybe occasionally Christmas, New Year's, Epiphany, and then just Christmas and New Year's, or sometimes just even Christmas. And with that, Christmas Day becomes the center. It becomes a single day that is invested with all of this tradition and all of this importance instead.
I must say, Luke, you made that disclaimer at the start about your kind of your non-expertise, but I think that's the longest ever answer we've had on an episode ever. So, but in fairness, it's a massive question and it was admirably answered. I mean,
Thank
it
you.
actually sounds very fun, chaos, bounty, and all. And similar in some ways, different in others. I must say the point you make about kind of the one of the big shifts to do with Christmas being away from the community and towards the family. Um, it reminds me of a kind of another shift that historians talk about in terms of in a long-term shift from the medieval and period and early modernity towards modernity in general in society. The rising importance of the nuclear family away from kind of the local community and the village. So perhaps in that sense, Christmas is almost a microcosm, I guess, of society at large. I mean, would you go along with that?
I absolutely would. No, I very much would. And it aligns very much with sort of the invention of privacy and the invention of the private home and all of that as these ideals. That is definitely a part of it. There's other stuff built in there as well, obviously Industrial Revolution, and we'll talk probably a little bit more later about some of the other options in there as well. But I think you're dead on, Josh, that very much this is aligning with that.
I have well, I have lots of questions and I'll probably have lots more, but I'll stick to the script for now.
Who
I
wrote
mean,
this?
Luke is tongue in cheek. We won't say who
Uh,
wrote it, but he's
Indeed.
in the room at the moment, and it's not me. But yeah. So you've outlined a few kind of examples there in terms of Christmas traditions or things we associate to be
Mhm.
Christmassy. So the turkey, for example. The other foods, but also kind of the festivities, the drinking, and traditions we kind of recognize as Christmassy today. If you were to kind of show a person in the Napoleonic period, any person,
Mm.
the traditions that we have today and we recognize to be Christmassy, I'm thinking in all their kind of modern excess, the adverts, the kind of, as you say, the September adverts for Christmas. How familiar, how familiar would that kind of Christmas be to someone in the early 19th century?
I mean, the September adverts would be completely foreign. I mean, the whole nature of not the whole nature of advertising, but the whole nature of how advertising is done would have been completely foreign, right? We've talked about how newspapers have shifted and things like that. Um, so that would have been completely weird. Although you do find really in sort of once you get into the Victorian period, you begin to get a lot of the same language, right? You get these sort of things of the Christmas season seems to start earlier and earlier, but no one can tell me precisely when it starts. And right, that's a quote you can pull out and drop into 2024 with no problem whatsoever. But there are a couple of things that they would have recognized. In terms of decoration, right? Evergreens, holly, mistletoe, things like that are a long tradition. But they do begin to become commercialized as the century progresses. Now, part of this is purely just modernization and commercialization, but part of it is also urbanization. Because if you live in the countryside, you can just walk into a forest and grab whatever evergreens you want, right? And that was one of the big house party things was like grabbing the sleds, going out there, grabbing all the evergreens you need, and then decorating the house. But if you live in the center of London or Manchester or Leeds or something like that, or Edinburgh, you don't have the time and possibly not even the facility to go out and get those evergreens from a forest. So you have someone who is now a middleman who goes out, who gets them, and can then sells them to you. So we have this commercialization as part of urbanization that applies to everything, right? Food, clothing, et cetera, now applying to the Christmas season as well. Christmas trees would have existed in some places, but are definitely more common in Germany and places of sort of German descent, right? We've got notations of them in Germany. The This is definitely not the earliest, but one that sticks in my mind is from 1809. That's Coleridge talking about that in his work The Friend, right? He talks about this in 1809 in Germany. To a certain extent, yes, that is something that is going to be pulled in famously by Albert and the royal family. But it's not introduced by them. There are places that keep that tradition beforehand. Now, one that is definitely there, although less, of course, nowadays, thanks to central heating and that, is the Yule log, right? We refer to this stuff. Yule logs were big, not just for decoration, although that was an important part of it and sort of New Year's tradition, but also for warmth. And they are standard by this time. We see them in Germany as early as 1184, and in Britain, they're established by the 1620s, right? It makes sense. Everyone has a fireplace. Everyone is going to be burning wood already. So let's make it a special festive one and burn a particularly large piece of wood, right? That's fundamentally what a Yule log is. So you have some of these aesthetic and decorating traditions. So, for example, banisters wrapped in evergreens, mistletoe strung up, mantelpieces wrapped in evergreens. That the average Georgian would have looked at and gone, "Yeah, that makes sense. That's perfectly fine." It probably would have been slightly lusher or a different type of evergreen or things like that, but they wouldn't have blinked at that. The tree would have been sometimes, "Oh, I see you are of German heritage," or something like that, or "You're an eccentric." Gifting is also there, obviously not to the level of excess that we are familiar with. This is, as urbanization and commercialization and all of that. But before the 19th century, gifting was for New Year's. It was sort of the start of the New Year thing. And the transfer to Christmas as the gifting comes with the shift towards a family Christmas and family gifting as we move through the 19th century. Now, advertisements for Christmas and New Year's gifts go back to the early 18th century, right when advertising starts. And the early 19th century sees store adverts, basically advertising everything that you could get in one place. This is your one-stop shop for the holidays, that kind of thing, to draw people in. So it's less about how do I put this? The advertising is more from Tesco and less from Cadbury, if that makes sense. If you want to work at that right. So it's the stores, not the manufacturing.
It feels
Um,
strange hearing an American say that.
I'm trying to I'm trying to go for our most of our audience here, and this is
Well,
about
thank you.
largely about Christmas in 19th century England and Britain. So that's sort of why I'm going for that.
Good
In terms
expertise.
of Thank you, thank you. In terms of other traditions, one of the ones that surprised me with how early it was, but 1828, which is sort of the tail end of our era, right, sees the publication of what's called the Christmas box. Now, the Christmas box as a concept is something that goes throughout the 19th century, and it's what you give to your postman, to your servants. It's sort of a general selection of small gifts. Um, but the Christmas box in this case is italicized, and it's the very first published Christmas annual that features games and things like that for children. And you could get one every year. They were numbered, and this is where we get things like the Punch Annual and eventually the Giles Christmas Annual that are still available today. Right. So that starts in 1828. So a late Georgian, early Victorian would possibly have not blinked at that either.
It's I don't, do you know what the Argos catalog is?
I do, in fact, know what the Argos catalog is. Yeah, I outfitted portions of the bedsits I had in my undergraduate through Argos, and as per usual, I'm sure it's still this way. The quality was never what you thought it was going to be.
Yeah. Yeah, it never was. But it sounds like none of that would be too foreign. You paint a very interesting picture then of Christmas in that period. I do have a question though about when you speak about kind of commercialization and urbanization in the context of Christmas, in some ways it seems quite similar to conversations that people have today. And this perennial fear that seems to exist that quote unquote the meaning of Christmas is being lost. I mean, you only have to like watch a Christmas film, whether it be like The Grinch or something, where the moral of the story is essentially that Christmas is about, our hearts, it's not about the presents and everything. And perhaps you can trace that as far back as a Christmas Carol even. I guess that is my question. I mean, how far can you trace this back, and does it go before Dickens? Because based on what you're saying, it sounds like it might.
It does. It does. So this is what is academically referred to. I don't know if this is a term coined by Neil Armstrong or if it's just of that sort of very subgroup of the social history of Christmas. This is what's called the Christmas lament.
Oh wow.
And the Christmas lament is that the idea, and it's found throughout Christmas history, that we're celebrating Christmas wrong, right? That it is not kept, to use the Dickensian term, in the present age in the way that it was in the past, and crucially, the way in the past is the way it should be kept, right? That we're abandoning its traditions in favor of corrupting new ideas. To give you a couple of examples of this, in the Napoleonic Wars and the Revolutionary Wars, you have the Times worrying that aristocrats are abandoning their traditional duties to their vassals to drink and game in the capital instead, right? They're becoming absentee landlords for the Christmas season and thus ruining not only Yuletide, but also the great social hierarchy of England in and of itself. There's also, the talk of sort of industrialization and urbanization. Irving talks about this a little bit, basically shattering the old traditions of paternalism and deference, right? Much like World War I was going to destroy the sort of the golden age of the Victorians, so the Napoleonic Wars shatters the deference of the early Georgian period. In the Victorian period, we find an iconography of Christmas that's taking shape from the 1840s on that depicts the Christmas of an imagined, idealized past. And it's usually the Tudor and Elizabethan periods, especially. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? Because those are ages in which England was expansionist and had strong national identity. So it's where they're going to reach back to and pluck from. If you have Victoria on the throne, you're inevitably going to look at when you had Elizabeth on the throne. It's just sort of the way it seems to work. So in the Victorian period, we have a lot of people looking at all of this new commercialization and all of that and saying, we have abandoned the pure feasting traditions of the medieval period for all of this commercialization, all of this sort of petty cash. Then, as the period advances, we get sort of all of these new ideas, all of these new Christmas things are pulling us away from the purity of Dickens and the purity of the childhoods we all remember. And then into the modern period, of course, Christmas has become too commercial. And really, fundamentally, what this is about at the end of the day is nostalgia, right? It's nostalgia for either a realized or an idealized version of the Christmas of the past. Sometimes it's a Christmas of the past that we never experienced. Sometimes it's simply the Christmas of the past when we were children and everything seemed to be magical, right? When we would just go to bed and we wake up and there's hundreds of presents on the floor next, under the tree that we don't have to worry about the bills for. We don't have to worry about that. All we can do is eat candy and open presents, right? So there's that inevitable sort of nostalgia that drives this. And that is something that is pretty much constant. On top of that, you of course also have other critiques. You have Protestant reformers who are basically saying Christmas shouldn't exist or it shouldn't be celebrated the way it is, that Epiphany is more important, that Easter is very much more important, and driving that. And of course, that comes down to the point where under Cromwell and under the sort of Parliament, Christmas is done away with completely. And it's Charles II who brings that back. So you've got a whole bunch of different criticisms sort of aiming at different ways of doing this.
The social history of Christmas is something that I wasn't aware existed before today, but I now do know it exists. I should stick to the question list because I've just realized I'm preempting you in my excitement and indeed my bemusement about the existence of such a kind of a scholarly name for something like the Christmas lament. I might start talking about that in more common parlance now, or perhaps referring it to other festivals as well.
I think you really should, and I think you should also do it just to throw off your professors, see if any of them have heard of it.
I'd be really interested to see. I was going to say though, I want to start using it in respect for like Halloween and Easter, like the Easter lament. Where's the meaning of the good old traditional Easter bunny gone in place of
I know.
the commercialization and everything. Anyway, that's another episode. That's for springtime. So you touched on this, I think, in answer to the first question, but I guess this is an infinitely complicated picture that you're painting as you break it down, particularly in terms of class and region in
Mhm.
Britain. So kind of again another big question, but can you outline the kind of the landscape of Christmas celebration on the basis of those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, region is probably the easier option here. There are different things. Obviously, Scotland continues to this day to prioritize Hogmanay to a certain extent over Christmas, right? That is their one of their big celebrations. Um, Ireland today, Today, Irish Catholic Christmas and English Protestant Christmas basically look almost identical to each other. But there's obviously different church things like that. So you're going to get some differentiation there, and obviously Ireland is going to have much less of a problem with Protestant dissenters basically going, "You're doing this wrong." Other areas have their tradition. There's wassailing in the west of England, especially the southwest of England, and Wales, where they of course also have Iveri Luid, the skeleton horse that sort of shows up to wassail and ring in the new year. So you have these different traditions and different ways of coming at it. Um, a lot of this is also built off of different industries, right? So the industries that go to mining draw things out of there. The industries that go into factories will draw things out of there, and it all shifts in many different ways. In terms of class, richer folks obviously could afford to keep all 12 days of Christmas, right? They can afford to not work if they indeed do work for those 12 days. Um, but with one of the fascinating things I found in this is that with Christmas being used as an excuse to criticize aristocratic dissipation, what you get instead is the middle class being held up as the model. And this again ties into, right, the family, into the children Christmas, because it's sort of upper class, your kids are with nannies, there's all of that, the houses are too big, but the middle class is sort of that ideal family unit and privacy and all of that. The middle class is helping this themselves, of course, by claiming citizenship. Basically, they're pointing at their way of doing Christmas and saying, listen, we are keeping with British traditions. We are morally superior, and therefore we deserve a say in our government, and we deserve true citizenship. So give us the vote, pass the Great Reform Act, etc., etc., etc. Right? So there's a political politicization of this. Now, Christmas traditions and charity, of course, is used to reinforce class divides, right? Those that give versus those that receive, those that have versus those that have not, and also prompts increased worries about the poor, in terms of, oh God, do they have enough on the sort of compassionate side? Do they have enough warmth? Do they have enough food? Are they going to be happy? Are the kids going to be miserable? But also on the sort of moral panic side of, are we allowing them to continue their life of idleness by giving them beer at Christmas? And anyone who's ever paid attention to modern politics knows exactly what I'm talking about. Now, into this comes a very interesting new aspect as this all shifts, because as Christmas evolves, it puts new strains on two different categories. Now, one is as old as England itself, which is domestic servants, right? Cooks, maids, footmen, butlers, housekeepers, all of them are the ones now responsible for effectively running that middle class and upper class Christmas. So they are being put to work to run a Christmas that's not theirs, but also brand new strains. So shop workers who suddenly find themselves being run ragged in the Christmas shopping season, who were never had to work like that before. And as the trends of sending things, both Christmas cards and then packages, postmen suddenly find themselves run ragged along with sort of stagecoach drivers and then train conductors and things like that. So we see this new strain arising from the new consumerism, and the family Christmas sort of all sort of pushing together to again isolate those that keep this properly and can afford to keep this properly, and then underneath them and around them all of the people who cannot afford to keep Christmas properly, but without whom the proper family Christmas collapses.
I jokingly opened this episode with a list of your titles, but I am now going to kind of dive into those, I guess, and humor you by asking about some of your specific niche historical interests. So in terms of I guess uh, theatre and public spectacle, I suppose that's how I'd kind of frame that interest of yours. What does that look like in the Christmas season? I know today we'd think of perhaps pantomimes and maybe performances in general. I mean, how far do those things go back, and how familiar would they be to someone?
So pantomime is an 18th century thing. right? That's when it comes to England, and it is popular at Christmas. But the pantomimes that we're familiar with, right, the sort of classic fairy tales that you'd recognize, the type that are so popular that like the Goes Wrong troupe can make fun of them at Christmas, right? We can have Peter Pan goes wrong or Christmas Carol goes wrong. That's not there yet. Pantomime in our period looks far more like the Italian commedia dell'arte that it comes from, right? So we have sort of Scapin, we have the mischievous servants, the idiot masters, those classic tropes going back and forth, clowns that are in love with each other and causing massive amounts of trouble, misers being made fun of, all of that. And it's not until the mid 19th century that we start to see it switching to the fairy tales that we're more familiar with. But it is still being done at Christmas time. It's just the old school pantomime instead. And that is driving. And we do also see, some Mother Goose style things for the younger kids and that sort of stuff. Special performances do become increasingly popular and often end up incorporating current events. It's one of these bizarre things that you can only get in 19th century Britain, and I adore it. Like, so in 1827, right? The Battle of Navarino, which is the British, French, and Russian fleets destroying the combined Turkish-Egyptian fleet, and sort of ending that threat to the Greek War of Independence. That's fought on the 20th of October, 1827. So word gets to Britain of this victory right at the start of the holiday season. And several London theaters immediately start to incorporate grand images of this victory into their Christmas shows. So you've got pantomimes, you've got lots of this, you've got carols, and then suddenly you've got the Turkish fleet being blown to smithereens in Navarino Bay in Greece. And then right back to the Christmas stuff, which I think is it's that wonderful sort of pseudo Victorian, Georgian Victorian, like, nope, this is the zeitgeist, and we're riding it no matter what happens. Um, this extends as we go on, right? So by the time we get High Victorian, we're looking at what the newspapers refer to as the Christmas amusements, which is a period of multiple events every day between Boxing Day and Epiphany or Twelfth Night, right? That is the time when you take your kids to go see these shows. You yourself go to see them, and you see a lot of new panoramas open. You see a lot of new hippodramas open. You see new exhibits open, and it tends to be enormously popular. Now, there's an entire group that can barely afford this or indeed can't afford this. And so what they start to do and what they start to indulge in, as you'll see, is that that theatrical production and spectacle becomes truly public. They start sort of doing carols in the street. They start roving. And some of that spills out with more decorations and things like that to become more and more absolutely public, often to the horror of the more socially conservative who see this inevitably as the descent back into misrule and complete lack of order. But so we are seeing public spectacle, we're seeing theatrical production that all will acknowledge this, much like they acknowledge anniversaries and things like that. But it's going to take into the Victorian period to create truly specialized shows. So someone in the Georgian period, someone in 1815, wouldn't be surprised to see Christmas productions, but they would be surprised to see something, for example, of the breadth and sort of dedication of, say, the Radio City Christmas Spectacular with the Rockettes, right? But by the time we get to Victorian Music Hall, they would actually look at that and go, okay, yeah, I can see how this evolves pretty clearly from what I'm familiar with.
Same question, I guess, with an adjacent interest of yours. Tat. I don't think there's a time of the year that we'd associate more with tat and all the things it encompasses more than Christmas in the forms of presents we receive. Not that any presents that I've ever received have have been bad, but what's the deal with miscellany, if that's a synonym, and in this period in terms of people giving gifts and just how random can these things get?
They can get pretty random. I mean, gifts there are in plenty. For many, it's going to be food, which is almost always welcome, right? That's the one that hits pretty well. A lot of sort of small luxuries will be given. You'd see a lot of haberdashery, small scissors, ribbons, buttons, things like that, that are going to be sort of big and popular. There is going to be random stuff all over the place, especially as this sort of evolves and people try and find the iconography. So a lot of the iconography and Christmas specific tack that we're familiar with are fundamentally second half of the century developments. But as they go and as they evolve, there's a lot of really, really weird stuff that pops up before the standards. So before we get, sort of the permanent association with sort of snow-covered barns and robins and Santa Claus and things like that, you get like weird, creepy walking clocks to celebrate the new year, and you get this bonkers Victorian insanity. And you also get a large amount of this weird obsession with modernity. So you have images, for example, of Santa Claus delivering presents not on a sleigh, but on like a jet-powered balloon or modern motor cars, modern at the time motor cars and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of sort of this weird tact and iconography that evolves, but it's largely, as we look at it, sort of it's that okay, this is a an offshoot of the main thoroughfare that doesn't quite take off, right? It sort of becomes a sort of dying thing.
So, I mean, in all of the things you've outlined, it sounds quite familiar then, this kind of pre-Dickensian Christmas tradition, which is interesting in itself. And I might ask a question about this after, perhaps in relation to the conversation we had a few days ago with Rebecca Earl and some things that she said. But talking in terms of this familiarity with a few differences, do you think kind of in sum then it it's kind of not true that the Victorians and Dickens invented Christmas? Because that seems to be what you're getting at. And if that is the case, then where does that idea itself come from that we kind of credit Dickens with Christmas? This is very meta now, though.
No, it is. I mean, sort of, no, they did not invent Christmas. Christmas itself is, whether you want to take the religious viewpoint, in which case it's exactly 2,024 years old, or you take the sort of, we're coming out of end of year celebrations and Yule and all of that, switching from the sort of Wiccan and pagan into something more modern. But what they are responsible for is some of the iconography. And the thing is, it, it's that traditional history answer, right? It's yes and no. So Dickens and the royal family, thanks to illustrated press giving people something to see, right? They can see what the royal family is doing. Give people models and inspiration, and they encourage people to take this stuff up. But a lot of it is in the works already. So industrialization, urbanization, and commercialization are already changing everything. They've completely shifted how time off is understood and indulged in. But at the same time, they've skyrocketed the availability and significantly dropped the prices of foods and goods. So by the end of the 19th century, that turkey that only the wealthy could afford in 1815, now everyone can, not everyone, but now most people can afford at Christmas time. There's more goods, there's more manufacturing, so there's more stuff. In the modern world, that can be said to be a problem, but at this point, it's seen as nothing but a good thing. And so people can afford more things, they can have more things. So more gifts start to emerge, more goods start to emerge, people can indulge more, and all of this drives that consumerism, right? So on those bases, this is not the royal family and it's not Dickens, it's pure Adam Smith invisible hand economics. It is the developments of this period, however, combined with the iconography that give us so much of what we recognize. So, 1843 sees the first Christmas card that is commercially available and then sent. Only 4 years after that, the Christmas cracker is patented in 1847. The original ones were filled with sweets, but as manufacturing progresses and as more tat and more small toys are available, that extends as well and it becomes the standard Christmas crackers that we have today. By the way, a shout out to our quartermaster who's not here, but our military expert Liam. It isn't until 1860 that the saltpeter version of the cracker, the one that actually goes bang, is patented. That's an 1860 invention. Now, Clement Clark Moore's Visit from St. Nicholas, the sort of, 'twas the night before Christmas when all through the house, that's first published in the US in 1822, hammering home, in theory, what I've been saying, right, about all of this being earlier. But it doesn't make it to the UK until 1891, at which point it starts to shape the UK's view of Santa Claus, or St. Nicholas, or Father Christmas. Advertising and decorating takes hold as commercialization, industrialization, all of this sort of leaps ahead, and that grabs all of this and pushes the season into more people. And as companies realize they can make more money off this and they can sell off that, that starts to push the season forward chronologically, right? So that's when we start to get it appearing in late November and then early November, and then it goes on from there, right? So that's when we start to see Christmas appearing in shops earlier and things like that. With all of the toys, with all of that, with the obsession of the royal family, and with crucially Victorian morality at the same time, a focus starts to drill in on children. Children become the reason for the season, if you'll forgive that common phrase, although you may not actually have it in the UK, but over here in the States, it's very big among like the Bible Belt, right? Christ is the reason for the season. It's a reminder to put the religion back into it. So boisterous, drunken Yule is replaced by the innocence of a child's Christmas, right? This becomes a family thing, not a community thing. This drives the obsession with family Christmases, and also drives simultaneously a booming industry in gifts. Now, these gifts have their own associations behind them. A lot of them are going to be improving. Some of the first ads we see for Christmas gifts for kids are improving books, right? Get them thinking, get them reading, get them having fun. And then inevitably it becomes, are your toys made in the United Kingdom? And if it's a boy, give them toy soldiers so they can, contribute to Victoria's great and glorious warfare, right? It all moves on from there. This obsession with children, however, fascinatingly also leads to panic simultaneously. Because apparently Christmases, as well as being more and more children centric, provide the opportunity to corrupt children as they become more children centric. So children get whirled in more to public revels. They get whirled into children's performances. We start to see children in pantomimes. And there are reformers who have quotes basically saying, like, look at this prostitute. I can tell you exactly that she lost her innocence when she was in the Christmas pantomime as a 10-year-old and put on tights and someone leered at her and it all went downhill from there. Right? So there is that weird tie. And so all of this iconography starts to blend in with Dickens, blend in with illustrated magazines. And that's another crucial part of this, right? We're seeing an entire revolution in media that is changing how all of this is depicted from just the written word to suddenly people can stop at a street corner and then stop at a newsstand and see images of what Christmas, quote unquote, should be. And then they want to go out and get that stuff. So yes, the period is crucial. Yes, Dickens and the Victorians help, but it is very much this question of what comes first, right? Is it a chicken and the egg thing? What comes first? Is it the stocking or the presents, right? All driving one way or the other.
Beautiful allegory. Well put, Luke. And as ever with history, I guess when you ask complicated questions, you get complicated answers. But um, it seems to be the case then that while on the one hand, Christmas was so much of what we think of Christmas today, we do owe to the 19th century. The 19th century more broadly
Yeah.
than Dickens, by the way. It's also the case that some things just seem to go back further. So I have another question for you. If you could resurrect one thing from
Mm.
Georgian Christmas, what would it be and why?
You know, I think it would be. the lack of family exclusivity. We talk a lot these days about found family and that sort of stuff, and there is that movement, especially in sort of queer communities, as parents reject children and they find their own families and all of that. But the idea of a Christmas with friends sounds incredible. And it's something that has become like family Christmas has become so normalized that if you say you're not spending Christmas with family, people stare at you a little bit oddly. Or they assume that your family is dead and you need to be pitied or something like that. Right? So that sort of lack of family exclusivity, I think, would make Christmas more fun. It would make it more boisterous and community driven. And I think it would pull away some of that commercialism and put it back to really what it used to be, which is about getting together, having fun, and eating and drinking for 12 days straight.
That's a very well. It was going to be a very wholesome answer until until the eating and drinking for 12 days straight. But I'm tempted to agree. Luke, to be fair, I forget you are actually a historian of Britain. To be fair, but even so, I feel like that interview was a kind of an audition to be a Brit because you not only did you kind of show your literacy of English chains like Tesco and Argos and chocolate companies like Cadbury's, but you also had some beautiful Welsh pronunciation thrown in there as well.
Thank you. That I did do the research on that. For those of you who are curious, that tradition, the Ivari Lwyd is spelled Mari space Lwyd. So if you hear someone with an American accent or even a sort of East Country English accent say Mary Lloyd, that's probably what they mean as well, but that is not how the Welsh pronounce it. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate the compliment. I grew up with sort of British associations with Christmas. We had crackers at Christmas. My father did. My mother used to make mince pies for my father. We had a Christmas pudding, all of that. So there is that aspect to it, and of course, then you steep yourself in the 19th century literary traditions and historical traditions to the level I have, and it's almost an inevitability that you come away the way I have. But I will take I will thank you, and I will take the compliments. Um, and yeah, I think it's just sort of. I think there's enough Americanisms in here to appeal to our American audience, but also we don't want to exclude our British and European audiences when it comes to Christmas.
Definitely good point, and I'm honored you think it's a compliment, but thank you. Um, folks, that was Luke Reynolds. Not that he needs any introduction or outro, but yes, thank you for that, Luke. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you all next time. See ya.
Folks, as the festive season approaches, consider whether you'd be willing to do any of these things to spread the Napoleonic cheer. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Then sign up to our newsletter by contacting us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get the regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a novel Christmas gift for the Napoleonicist in your life? Check out our merch via the link in the description in order to support our work while giving your loved ones something distinctive this winter. If you aren't in a position where you can dig into your pockets, then believe me, we totally get it. But that doesn't mean that you can't thank us for the episodes that you've enjoyed in a different way. All podcast platforms have ways for you to leave your reviews, so just spare us 2 minutes and leave a review wherever you listen to us. It makes a world of difference in boosting our international ranking and widening our reach. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and develop new exciting documentary channels. So if you want to be kept entertained on a daily basis when it comes to Napoleonic nerdery, prices start from just £2 a month. And you can, if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and the enigmatically named Zed. The Chiefs of Staff: that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.